If you do any sort of questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I'm Angela Van Arsdale. I'm on the retail leasing team here at Graffito. I've been doing retail restaurant leasing for about 12 years now, and with Graffito for almost 5 of those years. And I'm joined by Tanya Celestin, and I'll flip it over to her to introduce herself, and also Wendell Joseph, who is newest member of the Graffito team, who will be listening in and helping to field some questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Celestin. I work on the retail leasing team with Angela. Graffito is a team of 9 folks, and 4 of us make up the leasing team. We specialize in mixed-use developments with like larger institutional landlords, but I think our what we specialize in is kind of being the translator between these larger landlords and local independent operators. And we like to think ourselves as like the liaison or the translator between the two parties, trying to get them together on deals so that we can create more dynamic spaces and places that we all want to frequent, and still keep the character of the neighborhoods. Anything else, Angela, that you want to add about Graffito? I think we've
Yeah,
been, yeah,
I think
sorry.
you nailed it. I think part of the mission and ethos of our company is really to support and enhance small businesses, particularly local businesses in and around the city. We do a lot of work in Cambridge as well. So part of the reason why we're putting on these workshops is to make all of these resources and information available to small business owners so that you're all equipped to go through this leasing process. It is pretty daunting if you're not familiar with it, and there are a lot of steps to it. So as was mentioned earlier, on the kickoff, was we put together this document called a Toolkit that is available, and everyone will get a copy of this. It's also available in multiple languages on our website, graffito.com. And it goes into pretty significant detail and breaks down the process for you all to understand generally the leasing process, but then it gets into the granular of each section and defines terms, shows specific examples, gives you a list of resources and other people that kind of touch the process of leasing, for example, attorneys or architects, people that you'll touch along the way and as you kind of put together your team. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all of the details today, but this is fully available on our website, and you will get, I believe, a copy as well. It's we have it available in book form, and on the website, it's available in multiple languages as well. So that's a long-winded way of saying why we're here and what we're going to be going through today. But again, just emphasizing the importance of you all, small business owners, and helping you to find space in the community and kind of demystify this process, hopefully in some way.
Yeah, that's right. And we'll be toggling back and forth between this presentation that you see here and our website, just so you all get more familiar with the contents in the toolkit. So I'll be switching screens a bit. All right. And sorry, I think I have the wrong presentation. Hold on for just 1 second.
Yeah, well, while Tanya's pulling that up, I know we did see a few general themes in terms of what people are hoping to get out of this workshop today. If there are kind of additional themes, feel free to put them in the chat down below. But we are going to be reserving some time at the end for specific questions of things that are, in more detail with what we go through today, as well as anything specific that we didn't cover. I think the broad themes that we did see a bunch of people write down are, how do I find a space? Where do I start? I've never gone through the process before. It's my first time. We saw a lot of that, so we'll dive right into that. And then we also saw questions around rent, affordability, triple net lease terms, things pertaining to the economic piece of it. So we'll touch on that as well.
So we'd love to start off and hear a little bit from each of you on why you're here today and what type of business you have. If you want to put that in the chat or even go off of mute so we can hear a little bit about your business, where you're at in the process, if you just started a business, if you just started your search for a location, just so we can personalize our presentation a little bit more and get to know who you are. Let me see if I can look in the chat.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of hard copies, paper copies of the toolkit as well available for people.
Let me know if I'm missing anything in the chat. We'll give just
so
a
we
couple of, we could just move on.
Yeah, I think while everyone, if you want to put something in the chat while you do that, we can go through and just kind of briefly flip through the toolkit so you can see what it looks like. But why we're here again is to help you find and execute a lease for a space. So there are a lot of steps along the way from starting from that idea until opening your store. So we've really broken that down into 7 phases of that process. And we'll touch on those generally, because we could spend a whole 2-hour workshop on just one of those phases, but it does go into detail here as Tanya flips through the toolkit. And then just outlining a couple different resources, defining some terms that are usually thrown around during lease negotiation or during the search process. So we'll provide those resources and try to touch on as many things as we can in this 2 minutes.
Okay. Did I miss anything in the chat? All right, we'll
We
keep
do
going.
have a couple of folks who've chimed in with some of the businesses that they run. And so we have Magdalena, who has a mobile dog grooming business, and Emma Bett, who's planning on starting a restaurant business. We also have an esthetician on the call with us.
Good to know. Thanks, Wendell.
Yes,
So one of the
I like the mix of different uses because it'll determine some of the questions that you ask in your search. But I'll flip it to Tanya for the very first phase of the search process.
So one of the things that we like to encourage operators to do as they're starting their search for a physical location is really create a nice intro, a way for the landlords and the brokers that they may contact to get a better idea of them as a business, their experience as operators, basically putting your best foot forward. We call it a concept deck, and this concept deck can be in any format that you like. Some people create it in Canva, if you're familiar with that. You can create a PowerPoint presentation or even a small document that just gives a brief introduction to your company. Here we have some bullets of some of the contents of the concept deck. Your story and mission. Why did you create this business? What need are you fulfilling that you think customers may appeal to? History of your business. If this is your first physical location, did you have maybe pop-ups beforehand or a mobile business, or where could customers find you beforehand, and where did you track your clientele? business type and comparables. It's always nice to be able to refer back to other businesses so that landlords and brokers can get a better idea of what type of industry you're in, what type of services you provide. Atmosphere and inspiration imagery. For your next location, how do you want the space to look? How do you want customers to interact with your space and your staff? Space requirements. It's always good to have an idea of how much space you need. It doesn't have to be as specific as the exact square footage, but if you're a restaurant, maybe considering how many seats indoors and outdoors that you may need. All of those helps, whether it's, again, landlords or brokers, figure out what type of space you're interested in, how much space you need. Some of these general questions can help define that. And then your team. Do you already have staff on board? Or maybe, you know, if you're a restaurant, if you already have a chef, if you're the owner and operator, maybe you're not the chef, do you already have someone who will step into that position and help you out? I'll pull up Las Palmas deck. Our in-house design team helped Las Palmas with their concept deck. They're a Dominican restaurant out of Rosendale. And their concept deck, we like to use it as an example because it's super simple, but it gives good information about who they are. As you see here, they're a family and minority owned business, gives a little bit about their history. Here you see a picture. I think images always help. You want it to be easy to read, but still give enough information about your business and their history. You know, how did they start? Where have they been before in terms of pop-ups or short-term leases or a food truck or something like that? How they would define their business is also important. And here you see their design and aesthetic inspiration. Again, this helps landlords and brokers understand what type of space that you want to create. Sample menu, if you're a restaurant or if you're retail or a service-based business, what type of services you're offering. Again, more images. And a little bit about what they're looking for. For restaurants, it'll be a little bit more specific. For retail, maybe you just need a simple box with, you know, a bathroom and you'll build out offices or whatever, but it's always good to just give as much information as possible so those who interact with you or see your concept deck could really think about what spaces they can offer for you. So this is, again, available on our website in our small business toolkit, and you can refer to this at any time. We also have a concept deck outline that gives you some key questions that landlords typically ask, and that can help you to create your own concept deck.
So once you've got your concept deck put together, it's time to really hone in on where you're looking and what you're looking for. So we've kind of broken this down into certain questions and information that's helpful to have ahead of time before you start engaging on a space or with a broker. So first thing, you know, you probably already know who your target demographic is, but really honing in on the characteristics of the people that you're either targeting or people who are already customers of yours. What are the demographics you're looking for, and that will really determine or verify the area that you're looking in. A lot of operators kind of already know where they want to be, but it is helpful to go through the exercise of honing in on your demographic. And you know, there's a lot of brokers or teams or consultants who can help you with pulling demographic information and putting together maps that show exactly where geographically would be best based on your customer. The next is physical space requirements. So depending on what your concept is, and I'm glad we have kind of an interesting mix here, figuring out how much space you need, generally what components within your business you're going to need to physically lay out. So as Tanya had mentioned, you know, if you're a restaurant group, how much space are you going to need for back of house operations, and front of house, how many seats are you trying to get both inside and potentially for outdoor space? You know, if you're providing services, how many rooms or how many kind of stations are you going to need to lay out? You know, you're going to need a back area for employees, thinking about bathrooms. If you are a restaurant, what type of cooking are you doing? So if you're doing any sort of grease-laden cooking, you're going to need to have black iron exhaust. Some spaces can accommodate that and some can't. So if you are a restaurant, food use who will be doing cooking, that's a critical piece to identify at the very beginning of your search. New construction versus previously occupied space. Do you have a preference? For new construction, you know, it really depends on who that landlord is. Otherwise, you know, second generation space is usually less capital to get into and open. So it usually takes less time and less money to get from a lease signing to an open space in second generation space. However, if you know you're going to be partnering with an institutional landlord who is willing to do a lot of that construction for you, or provide you a tenant improvement allowance, which we'll define later on, but basically a sum of money to help you with your build out costs. That's an important thing to identify as well early on. Next one, who is the team supporting your search? So who are the key decision makers for your business? And are you going to be bringing on outside people such as business mentors or outside consultants? You know, if you're a restaurant, are you working with a restaurant consultant? Have you already engaged a broker who can also basically act as your consultant? So it's really identifying the people who are going to be helping you to make your decision, or making that decision with you. Next one is budget and funding sources. So, and we've got an example also, a sample kind of budget, funds and sources document through the toolkit that's available as well. But this is, you know, identifying what your budget is and how are you funding this project. So is this through your own assets? Is this a friend and family? Is this through the bank? Is this an SBA loan? Is this all of the above, right? So it's really identifying what those sources are going to be and what you think you're going to be able to afford. And then kind of touching on that is the next one, sales projections and rent tolerance. So as you get into this search and kind of fine tune your business model, you should be able to figure out what you think you're going to be able to do in sales over the course of the year, and hopefully grow that business as time goes on. And once you understand what you think you're going to be able to do in sales, we like to say that you take that number and you work backwards into what, based on that number, what you'll be able to pay in rent. So typically, you know, across retail and restaurants, we typically like to advise owners not to go outside of like an 8 to 12% occupancy rent, meaning you're not paying more than 8 to 12% on rent of what your sales projections are. So really keeping that number, that occupancy percentage, as low as possible, to ensure the success and health of your company and to ensure growth as your lease term progresses. So that's a really important one, understanding what you think you'll be able to do in sales, because then we'll be able to figure out what you'll be able to pay in rent, and that dictates geography, deal terms, negotiating. It affects the whole deal. So that's a really critical one. And then lastly, timing and schedule. So, if you have a date that you really need to be open or that you really want to be open, work backwards from that. I'd say typically the whole process from starting to put your concept together and searching for a space to opening takes about a year. So, and usually in instances today, just where the market is and how slow things are and building out spaces, it even takes a little bit longer in some cases. So I would have the expectation of this whole process taking about a year.
Then in your search for real estate, so you'll typically engage with landlords and brokers. A broker may represent the landlord on the space that you are inquiring about. And we are also brokers. And so our clients are typically landlords, developers who are also landlords of the spaces. So let's say you contacted Graffito, our company, because you were interested in one of our spaces. We would talk you through the process, give you information about the space on behalf of the landlord. It's important for you to understand the role of real estate brokers. When you're contacting a space and you're in contact with a broker, they typically represent the landlord. But you can contact a broker or real estate agent who specializes in retail leasing on your behalf. And they would be a tenant representative, and they would work on your behalf on looking for properties that fit your requirements, helping you through setting up tours, working through the negotiation phase, all of that. So real estate agents or brokers work typically for the landlord if you're contacting them. And so they have a responsibility to the landlord, confidentiality, disclosure, all of that. So it's important to kind of understand the roles of each party that you're dealing with, and understand that unless implicitly said, the broker will be working for the landlord. But it is something to consider if you want to have a tenant broker on your side working on your behalf. One thing to note is that in commercial real estate or retail leasing, the brokers are typically paid by the landlord. So I know in residential real estate, which I used to work in, that was usually the question where customers or clients were concerned about if they had to pay the broker and how that would work within their budget. So one thing to know in retail leasing is that brokers, both sides, are typically paid by the landlord. So a tenant broker would be working on your behalf, and once the lease is executed, the brokers would have an agreement with the landlord that they would be paid. So it is beneficial for you as a tenant to have a broker on your side. They'll be able to advise you and give you advice on the process. And there are a couple of brokerages that are pretty popular in Boston, in the greater Boston area, that you can contact. It does, again, going back to the Concept Act, it does help to provide as much information as possible to them so that they can work on your behalf and put the best foot forward and introduce you to the brokerage community and the landlords that they have relationships with, to help you with your search. So basically, the more information you provide to the tenant, to the broker, is helpful for you to find a space.
And yes, just to kind of reiterate what Tanya was saying, you know, if as a tenant you go out and you do your own search, that's known as an independent search. A lot of tenants do end up doing that. I will say one of the topics someone had put as something they wanted to get out of this is, how do I find spaces, and you know, how do I sort of uncover opportunities, and sort of, you know, edge out other operators looking for the same space. I will say that by working with a broker, definitely helps. As a tenant, there's really no downside to using a broker. At the end of the day, they're getting paid by the landlord. They are incentivized to find you a space and to get a lease signed, because that's when they get paid. So they're really on your team as consultants, essentially. So as much information as Tanya mentioned that you can provide them, so that they fully understand your business, your priorities, exactly where you're looking, the types of space you're looking for, your budget, then they can go out, and they do have other resources similar to residential real estate. If you're familiar with MLS, commercial brokers also have other resources similar to that, as well as a whole sort of network with other brokers and other landlords, where they're a little bit kind of better equipped to figure out if, oh, this space isn't available today, but I know that it's going to become available. So they've got a little bit more information that they can pass along to you, which is which is helpful. And again, they're on your team, and it's not part of your budget to pay them. So there really isn't a downside to using a broker. I think it's really only helpful. I would add, it is important to work with a broker that you either already know, or do an interview. Figure out, you know, who is the best fit for you, the best, you know, has a style that works with you. Someone that you trust is really important, because you're going to be bringing them onto your team. And it's also very important to make sure that they have specific experience in retail and restaurant leasing. You know, you might have a friend who is a residential broker. We do see this a lot, and there are certain nuances that your broker is just better equipped to kind of tackle throughout the process if they're familiar specifically with retail and restaurant leasing. So based on your business, is how you would kind of go about finding the broker that's right for you if you don't know anyone. But here we have listed a handful of commercial brokerage groups who do have specific retail leasing either teams, or that's all they do is retail leasing. But as Tanya mentioned, there are a number of them in the Boston area. So it would behoove you to just kind of do your own research, and again, you know, have a few conversations and figure out who is going to be the best match for you, because it is really important to make sure that they understand you and also your business. And then lastly, what a broker expects is just making sure the operator has a clear direction and understanding for where they're looking. And they might not have that answer right out of the gate, but understanding their business in and out, you know, really having that concept deck. So it's a very helpful tool for the process to really kick everything off and for everybody to understand, so that the broker can work with the operator to figure out a clear path and going forward. and to have clear communication on both ends, so everyone's on the same page. How are we doing on the chat? Any other questions? Feel free to rattle off any questions as we're going through this too.
No new questions in the chat. I think folks are just digesting all this wonderful information.
It's a
Thanks,
lot.
Yeah. Which is why we give you all, or why we made the roadmap available on our site for free, because we know that it's a lot to digest. And even in this presentation, I'm sure afterwards you all will have additional questions. Hopefully we can answer some of that today. And the roadmap is available for you all to, to kind of review at your own time as well. All right. And then, so there are also different types of landlords, and it's important to get to understand the general differences between the ones that you may encounter in Massachusetts specifically. I think in the greater Boston area, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, you'll encounter a lot of different properties with a lot of different landlords. Some we've listed on the side. Again, we specialize in mixed use developments, which basically means that there is retail on the ground floor and upstairs is either residential or lab and office. And each type of landlord will have different incentives based on the property and their goals for that property. Usually with mixed use developments, they look at retail as an amenity to the upstairs tenants. So they derive most of their profits or their rents from upstairs, and retail helps to support that. So the better the retail, the more attractive the retail on the ground floor, they're able to get a little bit more rent from the office folks upstairs or the residential units upstairs. Universities and nonprofits may have, a more mission-based goal for their retail. And then sometimes you'll encounter landlords who maybe it's one person or a family who owns the retail. Typically, because that property is their bread and butter, they may be more focused on higher rent or getting someone or an operator into the space quickly, because they have to pay that mortgage or pay the loans that they may have on that space. So some of our clients include Matimco, which is MIT's endowment fund, and Harvard. They typically see retail as a more holistic view of their assets, and are looking for the right tenants instead of just anyone. Some landlords may want to focus more on local independent operators, again, to add more character to the neighborhood or their properties. And some landlords prefer to do deals with national chains that they feel are more secure. So it's probably a good question to ask the broker or a landlord that you encounter, like, is this a family owned property? Is this mixed use development? Just to get a little bit more of an understanding of what their goals may be for the property, and how you fit into that idea that they may have for the property. And then as stated earlier, between the start of your search to when your doors open, generally takes about 12 months. We have a sample timeline on the right that kind of goes through the process. And some of the stages may be engagement, where you contact the broker or the landlord to tour the space and to learn more about the property. LOI negotiations is LOI is shorthand for letter of intent. That is a proposal or a deal memo. That's kind of a short form proposal that generally outlines the basic deal terms, you know, the base rent, or I'm sorry, the rent, the term of the lease, all of that, before you bring in attorneys. So the letter of intent will generally be between the broker and landlord and you as the tenant, and if you have a broker, because these are business items that are being discussed, it's typically best to iron those out before you bring in an attorney, since you would be paying an attorney, you know, by the hour or for their time. And then the attorney, once the basic deal terms are agreed upon by both parties, the attorney will, or the attorneys on both sides, will be able to finalize the more minute details that the lease may have. And then lease negotiations, depending on the parties and who's involved, could take a few months sometimes. So it's good to get an understanding of the length of time for each process. Again, with institutional landlords, because there's more parties involved. And when we say institutional landlords, we mean landlords with larger property holdings, whether that's more square footage or more properties. Generally, they have properties throughout the nation or throughout the region, and they may not even be based in Massachusetts. So when you have a larger team like that, there's more people involved. So sometimes that makes the negotiations take a little bit longer. And then building out the space takes some time, especially with construction delays. All of that can factor into the timeline. So it's good to start soon, start as soon as you can, just to get get more understanding of how the process works, and give yourself between like 12 to 18 months of when you plan to open. One thing to note is that new construction or first generation space, where you're building out the space to your specifications, takes more time than if you're moving into a space that was already retail or was already a restaurant. That can cut maybe, you know, a few months, if not like 6 months from the process. So it depends on the space as well, but the sample timeline hopefully helps you in figuring out how long things take.
All right. So you've identified your space, you've engaged with a broker, or you've engaged directly with the landlord. The landlord's excited to engage with you and see if we can move this forward. So what happens first is that, as Tanya mentioned, a letter of intent, or also called an LOI, which is really just, it's a non-binding proposal that outlines all of the major deal terms. So usually the landlord will issue the first proposal to you, the tenant. And when you receive that, you know, everything is negotiable. So you're not going to receive that proposal and say, okay, yeah, looks good, sign it. Let's now move on to the lease document, which is binding. But it's really meant to be a conversation, and really get to terms that you feel comfortable with. So it does go back and forth between the tenant and the landlord a few times, to really iron out all the questions that you might have, and to make sure that you fully understand all of the different components that they've outlined in that document. And also to push back. You know, landlords will issue these initial proposals with the expectation that the tenant is going to redline it and counter. So it's meant to be a back and forth conversation to outline these major business terms, before you, as Tanya mentioned, engage an attorney, and before a full lease document is drafted. The LOI is typically only a handful of pages, you know, anywhere from 2 to around 5. It's not a lengthy document, and again, it is non-binding, so you can go through this whole process. And, at the end of the day, if something's changed and, oh, I don't like this space anymore, or I want to shift gears and look at this other space, it's non-binding. So you can walk away without any sort of obligation from that document. So I just want to make that clear. And then we do have a sample proposal that we can just quickly flip through to show you what a kind of a standard letter of intent might look like. Generally, these terms are mostly the same with every LOI that's issued. Sometimes you see things that are, specific to a project that are inserted, but for the most part, these are the general terms that you'll end up seeing. So Tanya, if you just start at the beginning, sorry, I'll just quickly go through this. So it outlines tenant, and here you would put the actual entity of your business. So whatever that entity is, that would be signing the binding document of the lease. So you would put that there. The landlord would put their entity there. And then you define what the space is, so the premises. So it's approximately 2,500 square feet. And it's located on the ground floor of 905 Main Street in Boston, Massachusetts. If there is outdoor seating, that's usually mentioned here as well. One thing to note that it is not typical to pay rent on outdoor space, but it is important to note that that outdoor space goes with your space in this document. Proposed use. So you describe exactly what your business is. I'm a pizza shop that serves, various kinds of pizza and calzones for lunch and dinner. So, you can get pretty detailed in that proposed use, or you can kind of keep it a little bit vague. Usually the very detailed language is more defined in the lease document, but you do want to outline exactly what your business is so it's clear. The next line item here is exclusive. So this is something that we do recommend if you're a tenant that you do put something along this in there. And basically this clause states that if you're going into a building or a shopping center that has more retail space than just the space you're looking at, you're asking the landlord not to lease any of the other space to a similar use as yours. So again, I'm a pizza shop. I'm asking you, landlord, not to lease the next retail space next to me to another pizza shop. Because obviously you don't want to cannibalize your sales. Usually the landlord is on board with that because they want you to be successful. But it is important to kind of define what you're asking them in that clause, and just to protect your own business. Hours of operation, usually landlords put that in as minimum hours of operation because they do want to see active storefronts in their properties. You don't want to sign a lease and say that your hours of operation are undefined, or we'll be open 2 hours a day, or 3 days a week, what have you. So the landlord usually puts that in just to ensure that you're going to be open. And if there's any sort of residents or businesses that are above your space in that building, they want to make sure that those tenants upstairs have you as an amenity to service them. Lease term. So here can be flexible. I'd say the standard market lease terms we usually see are anywhere from 5 years to 10 years as the base lease term. And then you'll see that there are usually options to extend that beyond the base term. So for example, you could see, you'll have a 10-year base term from rent commencement plus 2 5-year options to renew, which basically would give you 20 years potentially of control of that space. Typically based on how much money you're going to need to spend to put into the space and get open, usually it's worthwhile to get a longer term to basically recoup those costs and move forward to be profitable. But that just depends on your business model and how much capital you're putting into the space. So it's really based on what your preference is. And then here we have base rent. So that's usually broken out by square foot. You'll notice here that it does say triple net. So just to flag for you, and I won't go through every line item, so I'll try and speed this up. But base rent is the rent per square foot you pay, and then the triple net is another number per square foot that you pay in addition to the base rent. So that triple net number is just the retailer's proportionate share of the building's real estate taxes, insurance, and what's called common area maintenance charges. So you'll see 2 line items down, this additional rent clause. This is just, it's an additional number, so call it, it's an added $12 per square foot. That $12 is the retail space's pro rata share of what they need to pay for the building's taxes, insurance, and maintenance charges. The common area maintenance is stuff like,
No.
snow plowing or, maintenance on a parking lot and, common areas within the project that impact that business and impact your ability to operate. Not necessarily within your space, but things that are adjacent or go with the building that do impact your business. So depending on what the taxes are for that building, I know in Cambridge they're not cheap. But usually, as you go into the lease process, you request what the common area maintenance charges are. Your attorney will really skim through those and make sure that they're all applicable to your business, so you're not paying on something that really doesn't affect you, that you shouldn't be paying on. The taxes and insurance, unfortunately, those are what they are. So it is important to understand what the pro rata share for your space would be and what that number is. Because at the end of the day, you got to add up what you're paying for the base rent and what that additional rent is to get that gross number, what's called a gross number of everything together. And that's what you're going to be paying per month to rent the space. So it is a little bit confusing and can be overlooked that you're paying, that the cost is the base rent, but you have to add that additional rent if it is a triple net lease. And usually, I'd say 8 times out of 10, you're looking at a triple net lease. 2 times out of 10, you'll probably see what's called a gross lease. And that is just an instance where those numbers have already been added. So it's just one number. And that's a little bit more straightforward, but it's just one number combined, and the triple net charges or the additional rent charges are not separated out. Percentage rent, this is actually quite common now. I'd say, pre-pandemic, probably pre like 2019, you would see this here and there. But we're seeing this in almost all of our leases now. So percentage rent is a mechanism that basically protects the tenant's downside and basically shares the upside with the landlord. So if you hit a certain number of sales, anything beyond that, you share with the landlord. And what it's meant to do is, if you're offering percentage rent, typically you'll be able to negotiate a lower base rent. So you try and get that base rent down as low as you possibly can. And then if you end up going into that space and you knock it out of the park and you're doing really well and you hit a certain sales threshold, then anything beyond that, you're happily going to pay 5-6% of that gross sales over that break point with the landlord. So it's a little bit confusing, and it's pretty detailed out in our toolkit, but it's basically a negotiation tool that you can offer to basically get that base rent down as low as you can to protect your downside. And then, so once the rent structure is kind of hashed out here, then it goes into more of the timeline. So milestone dates throughout the process, when the lease commences, which is a defined moment in time when your lease starts and time, the clock starts ticking. A delivery date is a defined time where the landlord is handing over the keys to the space, and you're receiving that space from them. And that is to either finish doing work or open for business. And then another defined time is the rent commencement, which is also negotiable. So you want to make sure that you're not starting to pay rent before you're open. So you want to ensure that, you've got your permits, you're fully built out. Ideally, you build in some amount of free rent period, whether that's a couple of months or what have you. But you want to make sure that there are certain things that are already in place before you start writing a check to the landlord. So that's an important piece. And then going through the next section here, and I'll try and speed up. Landlord's work and tenant improvements. So landlord's work, they'll define how a space is going to be delivered to you. So if they are going to be doing any sort of improvements to the space, if it's new construction, they'll outline exactly what will be in the space, all the MEPs, what the finishes are, what the HVAC capacity is, all of those things will be outlined for you so you understand, what the condition of the space will be. Tenant improvements, this just basically describes that you'll be doing your improvements and the landlord will have some reasonable approval just to make sure that, they're within the parameters of what is allowed in the building or by the city. And you'll have to submit your complete design plans to the landlord to make sure that that will be approved. Landlord contribution, also known as a tenant improvement allowance or TI. That is a sum of money that the landlord will give to a tenant to put towards their build out. And it's usually only towards hard costs of the build out. So not soft costs, meaning you can't use that landlord money to pay your attorney. It's really got to be used towards making the improvements to the space. So that is all negotiated throughout this process here. Security deposit and guarantee of the lease, that's all negotiated and sort of defined a little bit later on in the process after you've reviewed your financials with the landlord and kind of come to an agreement on what that security deposit will be and what the guarantee looks like for signing the lease. Assignment and subletting, That's usually mostly defined in the lease document. Permits, licenses, and approvals, those are all typically on the tenant to get. Whether that's building permits or a liquor license, anything depending on the municipality. But those are all outlined sometimes in the letter of intent, mostly in the lease. But they're meant to ensure that the tenant goes to get everything that they're going to need in order to operate. And it's usually associated with certain milestone dates so that that process doesn't lag. Permitting contingency, we would recommend that every tenant put this in there. If for whatever reason you sign a lease and all of a sudden you're not able to get the permits you need to operate, and all of a sudden you're stuck in a 10-year lease, not good. So we like to put a permitting contingency in there on behalf of our tenant clients, just to make sure that they do have an out if for whatever reason they're diligently pursuing their permits and they don't get them. So that's an important one. Signage, there's usually guidelines both per municipalities, but also signage guidelines for buildings that the landlords will provide tenants to show exactly where you can put your signage and what, the dimensions of it and the materials of it. It really depends on the landlords. And then these last few utilities, you pay for what you use. Usually they're all separated, and you pay those utility companies directly, not through the landlord. Trash and loading, identifying how you're going to be loading your space, where the trash is it common? Is it far away? Do you need to build, a conditioned holding space within your space, just to, if you're not going to be doing trash takeout often, and that needs to be consideration of how much space you take. Just understanding the logistics of your business and how it's going to interact with the rest of the building. Parking, that's pretty self-explanatory if there is parking. SNDA, that's just ensuring that if for whatever reason the landlord goes in default on their mortgage, basically your lease is still in place. Your lease is protected, your space is protected in order to operate within that premises. And then brokers, it outlines who is representing who, and it defines that the landlord pays those brokers. And then the rest of this is just sort of reiterating the fact that this is a non-binding, confidential document, and just, reiterates that part of it. But it is critical to put together and to negotiate fully before you go to lease so that you can hash out all of these major business issues, and just make sure that this is still a viable deal for both sides.
And typically there'll be exhibits attached to the letter of intent, a floor plan, which outlines the space, and a landlord work letter or a responsibility matrix, which again outlines the delivery conditions of the space. So this is all available on our website. Again, once you go to the toolkit under resources here, sorry, I didn't grab that. Under resources here, we have that sample letter of intent available for you all to read through.
And again, it's a lot. We could probably do a 2-hour workshop on just the letter of intent. So I'm sorry I kind of glazed through most of that, but happy to answer any specific questions either at the end of this, or feel free to email any of the three of us, and we can get back to you on specific questions. Once the LOI is fully negotiated, both sides will, both the landlord and the tenant will sign that document, and that will then trigger typically the landlord to draft the initial lease document. So at that point, you'll have your attorney on board to start engaging on the lease negotiation. And that process will typically take, like, I'd say 2 to 3 months to negotiate fully the lease document. As you're going through that lease document, it's sort of a delicate dance because you want to make sure that you have all of the information you need in order to get the process going and put your plans together. But you also don't want to fully design something and, pay all this money for architects and engineers and what have you, plus paying your attorney, if for whatever reason the lease blows up and you end up walking from the deal. So you want to make sure that you're already in the lease negotiation process. You're either you've got the lease signed or you're about to sign it. And that's when you really start to engage on with the design and putting together your plans so that you can get ready to go. It's also a good time if you're looking for a liquor license to start doing that due diligence and start those conversations. But as you can see on this kind of sample timeline, this is what's going to happen with a little bit of overlap during the lease negotiation process. But almost all of this will happen after you've signed a lease. What also does happen while you're negotiating the lease is doing your due diligence and figuring out who you're going to engage for your architect and engineer and other contractors. And basically, once you've got your signed lease and you're ready to go, you already have your team assembled and on board and you're ready to start. So when you move into this design, permitting, and construction phase, you're really just acting as the facilitator or like a quarterback to this process. But your architect, your engineer, and your contractor are going to work all together to put together your full design plans. You're going to show those to the landlord after you've signed the lease within a certain amount of time. You got to show the landlord, get their approval. Then you're going to take those documents and submit them to the city or ISD to make sure that you get those approvals and you get your permits. And once you get your permits, you can start swinging hammers and doing construction on your space. So that's just the general process. It is a little bit nuanced just in terms of timing because you really don't want to overcommit and start paying these fees for services until you're sure that you've got this lease secured and that you're fully intending to move forward and you've signed that binding agreement of the lease document.
And some things to note is that depending on the space, will determine who on the design team that you need. If the space is already built out, you may not necessarily need to engage an architect and engineer. But if you're dealing with new construction, you typically will. If the space is already designed for retail and you're just kind of stepping in and it doesn't need much, but maybe just cosmetic changes, you may engage a designer who will help you with the, interior design or layout of the space. So the space will dictate who on your team you need. And then if you already have a location, you may be busy, taking care of that location. And that's what we mean by your role may be a quarterback where you're facilitating and kind of delegating responsibility to other members of your team. Perhaps you have a manager or someone who can focus entirely on this new project while you focus on your current location. But these are, some prompts to get you going and think about how you'll build out your team and who will be on it. All right. Before we get to questions, I think it might be good just to time to go through the toolkit. Hopefully you all have that in front of you as well. Just want to make sure that you all are able to navigate it on our website. So our website is graffito.com. And on the far right corner, we have Small Biz Toolkit. This will take you to this page, which launches the roadmap. And again, it's broken out into different phases. So depending on where you are in the process, you can kind of jump to that phase. I'll head to planning and outreach just to give you an idea. And it'll give you some common terms to familiarize yourself. And it's pretty interactive, so hopefully this helps you all out. And we have some resources that can assist you. Resources is also available on the last tab. If you click on that, you'll see some of the documents that we referenced today. Example concept deck outline, the sample concept deck from Las Palmas that we have, some documents that help you put your financial projections together. A sample delivery condition, again, that's that landlord work letter or responsibility matrix that we mentioned that could be an exhibit to the letter of intent. And that will outline how the space will be delivered to you. A sample premise plan, again, that's the floor plan that usually is an exhibit to the letter of intent that specifies the space that you are interested in leasing. And then there's that letter of intent that we reference, and then network of subject matter experts, which we have put together from our network as well as others, with some of these team members that we mentioned in the design, permitting, and construction phase. Hopefully, these resources can help you. You'll have to do your due diligence, of course, and contact them directly, but hopefully this starts you out in starting to build that team that you need. All right. We'd love to hear any questions that you have. We'll look in the chat box and try to get to all of them, and feel free to unmute yourself if you can and let us know. Angela, oh,
I'm
sorry.
also going to stop recording too.
Thanks, Produce.